So I want to talk to you this morning. Over the last few weeks, we had been in this series. Called How to Hear God's Voice. And we've been talking to you for the last few weeks about what does it look like and how do we hear God's voice in multiple ways. We talked about in Scripture. We talked about people. We talked about promptings. We talked about desires. We talked about, last week, Pastor Mike gave a very powerful message about how do we hear God's voice through pain. Right? And so we have all these different ways that we hear God's voice. And so this morning I want to start out by just telling you the story of what does it look like on a practical level of hearing God's voice. And so about 3 years ago, there was this guy that was starting to feel something prompting in his spirit. He was feeling something a little bit different. He had a great job and was doing really well, and things were going awesome for him, but he felt like God was stirring something in his heart, that God was doing something a little bit different. And so he just found himself at a coffee shop in downtown, in the area where he seemed to hang out a lot, and he just found himself sitting there for over the course of a year, praying and thinking and journaling and writing and reading and just trying to figure out exactly what it is that God was doing. What was God calling him to? What did it look like? Why was it so different? Everybody else had it figured out what he was supposed to do and what it was supposed to look like, but he had it figured out, or he felt like God was calling him to something a little bit different. And over the course of a year, he sat at this coffee shop and he would journal and he would read through the book of Nehemiah and he would spend some time journaling and he would spend some time circling like what was probably like a 10-block radius in the area that he was in. He would walk 10 blocks praying and asking God for answers and just things and looking. And if you've ever read the book Circle Maker by Mark Batterson, it's a great book. And so he talked about it from the standpoint, if there's things in your life that you want, circle it in prayer, is the bottom line. And so he just spent this time walking in this area for a long time. Every Friday for a couple hours he would spend downtown reading and writing and praying and circling. And then all of a sudden this stat came across him as he was meeting with some other friends and meeting with some other people. There was this stat that 200,000 people in the city that he lived in, 200,000 people in the city that he lived in did not have a relationship with Jesus. That 200,000 people in the city that he lived in didn't go to church on a regular basis. And he found himself sitting in a coffee shop in downtown after walking for the last year, praying and circling and trying to figure out what to do. He found himself brokenhearted by what he had heard and brokenhearted by what was going on. And as the prayers began to grow and the vision and the idea of what God was calling him to began to grow, all of a sudden now, all of these prayers and all of this circle came into this idea of that he felt like God was saying, hey, I want you to do something, but I want you to do it within 2 miles of the area that you've been spending the last year in. And so he gets out a map of the city that he lives in, and he kind of puts a pin where he's been hanging out for the last year, and he just draws this big circle around this map and sees how big 2 miles is. Like if you just used me as a pin and went 2 miles in any direction, right? It's a lot bigger than we think. Like we don't think 2 miles is all that big, but you draw a 2-mile radius circle around an area, it's pretty big. Still brokenhearted, still broken by the lostness that is in the city that he loves so much and what's happening. And over the course of that year, as many of you probably already know, is what CityPlace Church came to be. That it wasn't just some crazy idea that a youth pastor at a church got that said, hey man, I just don't really like the way my senior pastor preaches, so I'm just going to go start another church. Or hey, I don't really feel loved at the church that I'm at, so I'm just going to go do this on my own. This thing that God has called us to, this thing that we've been at for the last 2.5 years, and many of you guys have been with us from day one, which is amazing, by the way. That God is calling us to something, and that God is developing something in me and in us of where we're headed and what's happening. But everything and the ideas for our church came out of this brokenness for the fact that there are 200,000 people in the city of Lakeland that do not have a relationship with Christ, or that they don't go to church on a regular basis. And if you if you've lived in Lakeland for any period of time, you can't help but drive and see a church like almost on every corner. Which kind of boggles my mind that if you know the stats, there's 600 churches in the greater Lakeland area, 600 plus churches, but yet we still have some 200,000 people who don't go to church. And one of the things that I heard multiple times from lots of people was, does Lakeland really need another church? Does Lakeland really need another church? Do we really need to plant another church? And my response to them always was this, man, if there's 200,000 people in the city of Lakeland who don't have a relationship with Jesus, then the answer to that question is a resounding yes. We need lots of churches. And I got this crazy idea that we're going to plant CityPlace Church, and I want to be responsible for planting 100 more churches over the course of time. Maybe not necessary here in Lakeland, but man, we need to do something. So I ask you the question this morning, have you ever been so moved by something? Have you ever been so moved by something that you knew that you had to do something about it? Maybe you've seen one of those commercials on TV with the starving children in Africa, and you're just like, your heart is broken, and there's sad music that goes along with it, and you're just like, man, I've got $30 a month. I'm going to donate $30 a month to help these starving children in Africa. Or if you've ever seen that commercial for the abused pets with Sarah McLachlan and the music that she's playing, like you want to cry every time you see the commercial, right? I mean, I'm a dog guy, but even that commercial, like I guess I'm not that emotional of a guy, but that commercial breaks my heart. Like, I'm like, Kim, let's just give lots of money to abused pets, right? Like you've ever just felt so moved, or maybe you had a friend that you knew that needed some help and you just needed to step in and help them with, maybe it was some money that they needed or whatever it may be, a friend that needed some help or a stranger that needed help. You ever been part of a movement where somebody comes in and says, hey man, my coworker, they lost their entire house to a fire this past weekend and they've got 3 kids and they lost everything. We're taking clothes donations and toys and food, and all of a sudden everybody chips in and just starts giving. Right? Alex, who's been part of our church from the beginning, he same thing in the last couple weeks, and maybe you've seen Facebook, you've seen the news. Like Alex was on all the news channels because there was a need in the city of Lakeland. One of the elderly homes in downtown lost power and people lost all their food, and Alex worked that route when he was a police officer and decided, hey man, I got to do something about this. And so he just started collecting Publix gift cards, and next thing you know, it catches the news and Channel 8 and Channel 10 and Fox News, and everybody's interviewing Alex about what does it look like to collect cards. And all of a sudden it went from a couple gift cards to over $800, I think, worth of gift cards that he's been able to bless these residents. Like, you just feel so moved by something that you have to do something. Or in a natural disaster, Irma comes or fire comes and people respond and people take off and go down and help clean up and do things. Like, Irma was one of the coolest things ever last year, and not in the hurricane itself, but in the fact of how everybody came together afterwards. Like my neighborhood per se, neighbors that I had never talked to were coming down and asking, hey, can I help clean up your yard? I was on one of my neighbor's roof putting shingles back on, which I had never done before, right? So there's all these people that are working together in the form of a natural disaster, but there's just like, man, we've got to do something. Like, have you ever been so moved? That whatever it may have been, you knew that you needed to do something. That you get overwhelmed with passion. You get overwhelmed with this idea, man, I've got to make a difference. And the scripture that we're going to look at this morning, and then I want to share some really cool stories with you guys and some things that have happened over the last few weeks in the life of our church, because I told our staff this past week as well, like, we just don't celebrate enough things. God is doing some really cool stuff, and I try to put some things on Facebook as much as we can and let you guys know what's happening. But man, there has been so many cool stories of just things that are happening and things that are moving. And sometimes we just get caught up in the idea of just coming to church and hanging out and wondering if anything's even really happening and what is God even really doing and is God even really moving. And I want to tell you that He is. And that we have this wave of momentum that we get a chance to jump on, and we get a chance to ride this wave. And in the story that we're going to look at today, it's in the book of Nehemiah. It's in the book of Nehemiah, and you can turn there. It's a story that I've shared with you guys before, but as you turn to the book of Nehemiah, we'll be in chapter 4. I want to share with you kind of the backstory if you don't know it. The Nehemiah is this guy who is, as he's listed in the scriptures, he was a cupbearer. He was a cupbearer to the king, which basically means that he ate and drank everything before the king did. So if someone poisoned the food or poisoned the wine, then he would die before the king. Great job, right? And so that was his job. But he was the king's right-hand person. He was the king's right-hand man. And all of a sudden, the walls are destroyed after wars and battles and fights and all these things that are happening. The walls around Jerusalem are destroyed. And Nehemiah's brothers come to Nehemiah and they share this heartbreaking story to him about how the walls are broken down and how the city's in ruins and the people's spirits are broken and the people are scattered everywhere. And the home and the town that Nehemiah knew and loved so much was in ruins. And if you read in Nehemiah chapter 1, and if you don't have anything that you're reading right now, I encourage you just read the book of Nehemiah this month. Take a chapter a day, half a chapter a day. But if you read in Nehemiah chapter 1, it says that immediately after Nehemiah was told this by his brothers, he was heartbroken. He was moved. That he just began to fast. That he just began to pray. That he just began to cry out. Like his heart was literally broken by what he had found out about his city. And the story goes on that he prays for a little bit and God tells him to approach the king, and he approaches the king and asks the king for waivers to go back to his town and to rebuild the walls, which the king had no business doing. I mean, he's the cupbearer. Like who's gonna now take Nehemiah's place? But through the favor of God, the king grants Nehemiah passage to go, gives him all these letters to get all the supplies that he needs from all the surrounding kingdoms. Like the king sets Nehemiah up. Well, God sets Nehemiah up through the king. And Nehemiah sets off on this journey and he gets back to Jerusalem. And he doesn't come back with this huge vision and this big thing about, hey, we're going to rebuild the walls. Like the second that he walked in, it tells you in Nehemiah 3, I believe it is, that he just kind of surveyed the city. That he walked and he rode and he just looked at the people and he looked at their spirits and he saw the walls that were broken and he just knew that something had to be done. And then when the time was right, he pulls everybody back together. Pulls everybody into this circle and he says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to rebuild the walls around this city. And as they begin to rebuild the walls, enemies start to attack and enemies seem to begin to plot against them. And enemies don't want the walls around Jerusalem rebuilt. They don't want that. And this is kind of where we're going to pick up in the story, that after some of the enemies have made this plan, and God, it says in the scriptures that God frustrated their plans. So we're going to pick up in the story. So look with me in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 15. When our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work, one with one hand, and held his weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped by his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall far from one another. And the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. And so in the story, there's a couple things that I want to point out to you this morning. That in this story, as Nehemiah and the people are rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem, which was no easy task. Like imagine a group of people rebuilding a wall around the city of Lakeland. Like it was no easy task that he had taken on himself. And the enemies are attacking them, and God had frustrated their plans. And Nehemiah is great, and why lots of pastors and lots of church planners read the book of Nehemiah, because there's so much great vision in what Nehemiah is doing. It helps us be able to formulate ideas and visions and dreams of where we're headed and what we're doing. And Nehemiah keeps the people together in the idea, hey, listen, and the rally at the end is, hey, they got a sword in one hand and a brick in the other, and they're doing whatever it takes to rebuild the walls. And he says, hey, listen, our God will fight for us. Just keep moving, keep building, keep fighting. Our God will fight for us. And so there's a couple things in the story that jump out to me as my music stand slides down. The first one is this, is that God is always working. That God is always working. In the story, it tells us that the enemies came together. In verse 15, the enemies' plans had been frustrated by God. That God is always working. That God is always moving. A couple weeks ago, Kim has started school this summer, and she's working on a degree in organizational leadership, which is awesome. She's my hero. And she's working on this degree in organizational leadership, and she had to do some videos. And so she does this video presentation that she has to submit for one of her ministry classes and leadership classes. And in that, she's talking about the building that we're moving to, and some of the demographics of the building and what's happening there. And there's, the number of people that are in the area and how many people have professed faith and how many don't. She's sharing some demographics, so I'm going to share with you here in a moment. But in the course of the video, she shares the video, and her professor reaches out to her by text or by email and says, hey, is the building that you and your husband's church are moving into, is that the old Lake Bonnie Baptist Church? Kim sends me this text and says, hey, was it Lake Bonnie Baptist there before? Because all we talk about is All Faith, which was the church just before us. And I was like, yeah, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, 90s. Like for 40 years, it was Lake Bonnie Baptist, and then All Faith took over in 2000 and was there from 2000 to 2017, and now we're there. So I'm like, yeah, it was Lake Bonnie Baptist. So she tells her professor that it is, and she goes, is there any way that I can meet you and Kevin there? I just have some stories that I want to share with you. I was baptized in that church when I was 7 years old. And so Kim asked me, hey, can we meet this professor? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And so we were getting ready to leave out with our family a couple weeks ago to go out of town for an overnight trip to Orlando. And so Kim and I meet her professor there. And the reason why I'm sharing this story is because she was so moved by what God is doing. And she gets out of her car, and we share some pleasantries and highs, how you doing, introduce some things. And we go to walk, and all of you guys have been there because of the work day. We go to walk in the main glass doors at the front of the church. And like, here's the outside, and here's the vestibule inside, or the lobby inside. Like, she steps in the doorway and just begins to weep. And she says, I'll be right back. I got to go get some Kleenexes. And she runs to her car, and she gets some Kleenexes, and she comes back, and she stands in the doorway, and she's literally weeping. And she goes, you guys have no idea. I've been praying for years that this church would be revitalized, that this church would be rebuilt. As I drive to work every day at Southeastern University, and as I drive by this place for years, I've been praying. I've watched the buildings deteriorate. I've watched the roofs cave in. I've watched this building that I grew up in, because when I was a small child, my dad abandoned our family. And we lived in a house directly behind the church. This is the building we're moving into. We lived in a house directly behind the church, and my dad abandoned us. And the only safe place that I felt was your church. And if you guys have been there and you've seen, like, there's this fire escape on the back of the building that looks like it's about to fall through. Like, if you step on it, you're going to fall to your death, right? And she said, when I told her we were removing it and we were adding a new fire escape, she starts crying again as we're walking the inside and the outside of the building. And I said, we got to add a new fire escape and do some things. And she starts crying again, and she goes, that's great, but that fire escape was my safe place. I would walk across the street, and I would sit on the staircase at the of the fire escape, and because for hours I would just sit there because at the church I felt safe. And the church took me and my family in, and at 7 I got baptized, and I grew up in this church, and then my mom met a great man here who became my stepfather and who was a pastor, and we eventually moved away as he took other churches. She goes, and then we moved back to Lakeland, and when all my friends were getting married in the 80s, and they were all wanting to get married in these huge churches, I wanted to get married here. And she brought her wedding pictures, right? And so she breaks out her wedding pictures, and she starts showing us her wedding pictures. And she said, I've been praying for years that somebody would take this building and that they would rebuild the building and they would revitalize the community. Just goosebumps inside, that to know from the fact that there have been people that we don't even know that have been praying for what's happening. God is always working. God was working for Nehemiah, and he's working for us. And so it's cool because I know another pastor that's part of the Baptist Association that we're part of here locally that was there in the 90s as a teenager. So I'm like, now we know someone from the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And I'm like, man, it would be so cool if we could meet someone who was there, like that was there in the 50s and the 60s when the church was first built and open. And so Sunday, Kim and I go to lunch with Micaiah. I can't even my own kid's name. Michaela. With Michaela. And we're sitting at Sonny's here in North Lakeland, and this elderly lady walks up that Kim and I used to attend church with years ago at another church, the church that Cassie and Leslie and I got saved and baptized in. And she walks up and she says, and with her cane, and she's like, do you guys remember me? And we're like, yeah, Miss Betty, we remember you. How are you doing? Bonnie, I'm getting all the names wrong today. Hey, yes, Miss Bonnie, how are you doing? It's good to talk to you, right? Kim's like, Bonnie, right? It's great to have your wife. As a pastor, it's great to have your wife on the front row because she corrects all your mistakes. It's awesome. Right? Just ruined my story. Anyway, so we met Bonnie, and I'm just kidding. So she comes up and she starts talking, and through the course of conversation, she said, hey, I heard that you guys are remodeling the old Lake Bonnie Baptist building. And I said, yes, ma'am, we are. She said, because my aunt attends her church. And she said, I heard that you guys are remodeling the building. She goes, you know, I went there in 1956. As a child, I went there. She goes, I'm 85 now. I look good for 85, don't I? And I go, yes, ma'am, you sure do. And she goes, but as a child, I went there. And she goes, you know, I have the complete history of that church. And I go, what? And she's like, I have the complete history. Like, it's not a lot, but it's the written history of who started the church and the original pastor and what the vision was and all these things. She goes, I have the whole history of the church at my house. So if you want it, I'd love to share it with you. I'm like, can we go now? Right? And so, because here's the thing for me. As we get ready to make this transition and move to this building in the next couple months, I want to embrace what's happened in the past. I don't want to just be like, hey, God gave us an old brick building. God's done some work through this church. The 2 churches that have been there have closed their doors due to whatever reasons. But, man, God's changed some lives in there, and now we get to go in and bridge that. Right? Lives that were changed in the 50s, lives that were changed in the 60s, lives that were changed in the 70s, lives that were changed in the 80s, lives that were changed in the 90s. And now we have the opportunity to come in and change some lives. And so I'm going to Bonnie's house this week and seeing what she has. I called her this week, she goes, it's not much. I'm like, Miss Bonnie, anything that you have will be great because I would love to share with our people the history of what God is doing now and what we've got the opportunity to embrace and move into. 2 cool stories in the last week or so of what's been happening. God is always working. And then this week, to you guys, this is just a chair. To me, it's a picture of what's to come. These aren't them, we bought 150 chairs as a church because that's all we could really afford right now. And you look around, there's not 150 people in here, right? And so we're going to do 150 chairs, and that's how we're going to get started. And if the church grows and people just pour in the doors, then we'll use these right here that we have to make up the difference until we can afford chairs because these bad boys are expensive. And so through Tim and Jenna, a friend of theirs that they know, Darlene, who's helping us do some interior designing stuff, picking colors and stuff because I'm awful at that and I don't want to do that. And so she's helping us do colors and things. Her daughter works at a church here in town called The Rock. And so this week, Darlene reaches out to me and says, hey, my daughter says that they have 200 chairs that are blue, and I know you guys are going with gray and blue themes, that they have 200 chairs in a pod that they're getting rid of because they're getting new chairs and they want to donate them to a church. So if you call my daughter Jill and you go by there, they may be able to they see if they're going to work for you. So I go by on Friday and I meet with The Rock, and this is one of the chairs that they want to give us, the other that was in their youth room. This blue matches one of the blues that's in the pattern of the new chairs that we bought. So we're going to be able to potentially get 200 chairs donated to us from the Rock Church in town, right? Kingdom-minded. 200 chairs that are donated to us, which gives us 350 chairs, which is more chairs than we'll ever need. So it's not a matter of, hey, we got 150 chairs. I hope that if we open our doors and 200 people walk in, what are we going to do? Like, we have all the chairs that we'll ever need. But the cool thing to me in the story is this. If you saw the Facebook post from earlier this week, we had the opportunity to donate all the pews. All the pews that were crammed in a pod, like crammed in that pod on the property. We've been able to donate 20-something pews to a church in Lake Wells who somebody committed arson against their church and burnt their church down, and they lost everything. We gave them pews for their new sanctuary. This past week, Crystal Lake Baptist, which is right around the corner from us, took 25 pews because their sanctuary was damaged during Hurricane Irma last year, and they needed new pews, and we gave them pews, and we gave another church pew. There's been a few people that have come and gotten some. But we gave first. We were generous with what we have. We didn't charge the churches any money. We didn't say, hey, give us $1,000 for the pews. Like, we just gave, they were for a church. They were free. And then after we give the pews on Wednesday, I get to call Thursday that somebody's got 200 chairs for us. But it's not just the idea of a chair. Like, it's the idea of all the empty chairs of what God's doing. I don't believe that God's blessed us with 350 chairs so that we can't fill them, is my point. So now we have a chair that represent people, that represent the people that are to come. God is always working. So I ask you the question this morning, how is God working and moving in your life? The second thing that I take away from the story is that they weren't afraid to work. They weren't afraid of a hard day's work. I mean, imagine this, right? You are rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem, and you've got a brick in one hand and a sword in another. Like, you're worried about your life, but you're trying to rebuild because of great vision that you have. And so how amazing is it that, they weren't afraid of work. And I don't believe that we are either. We were just at the building a couple weeks ago doing a service project, and we got people up in trees getting bit by bull ants and laying floors down and clearing jungles that used to be a playground and clearing that out and pulling landscaping out and doing all of this work of what we need to do to get the building ready. And we've got more ahead of us, but we've got Serve the City, and we've got a couple more work days that we're trying to get scheduled and planned out so that we can get things done. Like, man, I was there on Friday, and things are starting to come together. Like, you can start to see what this building is going to look like. They weren't afraid of work, and I know that we're not afraid of work, but it's not just about trimming trees and pulling landscaping and laying floors. It's about the work that it's going to take in the community. That community has seen this church deteriorate over the course of the last 10 years. That people that attended the church have left. They've seen buildings, the roofs caving in, and all these things that have happened on the building that we demolished, and all of this work that had to take place. It's going to take some hard work on our part to get into this community and show them what the church is supposed to be and what the church is all about, and how do we give them a place to belong, connect, and to grow. This people in the story of Nehemiah weren't afraid of hard work, and I know that we aren't either. We're going to build a new wall around this community. We're going to build a new wall around this community, so to speak. My pitch to you is, will you help us? Will you help us build a wall around this community? Because here's the thing. Get the demographics, and to the average person in church, demographics mean nothing. To me, they mean everything. Because it tells us who we're doing, where we're headed, who we're reaching, and what's about to happen. So I'm not going to bore you with all the demographic studies, but I'm going to give you a couple numbers because numbers are important. Because numbers represent people. And people represent life change. 60,000 people. 60,000 people in a 3-mile radius. So take our building, draw a 3-mile circle around it. You got 60,000 people within 3 miles. 15,000 of that 60,000 are under the age of 17. 15,000 are under the age of 17. Do you think we need to have a good children's ministry and youth ministry, right? 24,000 of that 60,000, 38 to 43%, so split the difference and say 40% of 60,000 is 24,000. 24,000 people who say they have no faith. Not that I'm a Christian, but I just don't go to church. 24,000 people of 60,000 people who say, according to the demographic study that we did on the area, they have no faith, which means I don't believe in God, I don't go to church, I may believe in God, but I just don't have any profession of faith whatsoever. And God is calling us and setting us down in this place. Because if you knew the story that backs up to all of this, and our staff does, and the core group that's been with us from the beginning know, I've knocked on every empty door in a 2-mile radius of downtown Lakeland. And God has opened, thought He was opening a door and then it slammed shut, or didn't open any doors at all. And I left myself frustrated, and found myself frustrated by the idea that we couldn't get in a building, because if we could find a building, man, it would change. 6 months we meet in another church that lets us use their space on Sunday nights. And then God opens up the door for us to be here at an elementary school for the last 2.5 years. And in that period, I've knocked on every door that you could knock on, and no doors opened except for this one. All of the financing that we should have got that probably on paper makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. That makes no sense whatsoever. On paper, for someone to loan us the amount of money it was going to take to renovate this building, on paper makes no sense, but the loans got automatically approved, hands down, unanimously approved by all the boards of the Florida Baptist Convention and the South Florida Baptist Association. Like, this is where God's calling us. Know it. Stories of Kim's professor and Miss Bonnie and all these people that have prayed over the building for years. The third idea is that they were ready for a fight. They were ready for a fight. God is always working. They weren't afraid of hard work, and they were ready for a fight. One of the things that gets pushed down and kind of hidden in the idea of church planting, so to speak, is the spiritual battle that this is. Like, we can talk about demographics, and we can have cool worship and chairs and lights and people out front saying good morning and cool kids environments and great youth environments, and we can have all these things that make church great, but man, there is a spiritual battle behind the scenes. And when I was going through my training 3 years ago through the Florida Baptist Convention, there was a whole session on the fact that planting a church is the biggest spiritual battle you'll ever step into, so you better find yourself on your knees a lot. I've been praying for our building. I know many of you have been praying for this new community and praying for our building as we move in, but it's not just about the church, and it's not just about us as leadership. You need to be praying for your husbands and praying for your wives and praying for your children and praying for your family, because there's a spiritual battle, I believe, that will come our way. Satan doesn't want us to move into this building. He doesn't want us to move into this area and become the light that I believe that we're supposed to be. So there could be some hardships that come our way. There could be some tough times that come our way. It goes like this in the spiritual realm of things, and I'm not going to go super deep with you this morning, but here's the idea. That if Satan can't trip me up, then he may attack my wife, or he may attack my children and trip them up, because that has a great effect on me. So if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm riding where I'm supposed to be, and I'm with God where I'm supposed to, and he can't trip me up, then he may throw something towards Kim's way, which could cause me to stumble a little bit, or lose focus, or lose my children. Like, there's a spiritual battle that is in this thing. These people that we're looking at in the story of Nehemiah were ready for a fight, and we need to be ready for a fight. Because there's no way that we can step into this new community, step into this new area, push back darkness, so to speak, and not expect there to be a spiritual battle. So here's my encouragement to you in that. Be praying. Know that I'm praying for you. Know that our staff is praying for you. Know that the leadership at our church is praying for you. But you need to be praying for you as well. Pray for protection over your families. Pray for protection over your children. Pray for protection on that. Prepare our hearts and prepare our minds for what is about to come.